We're on DAF Kuf Dalid Amid Aleph. And I'll just mention it again. Please, everyone, bring your psachim tomorrow. We'll get a head start on the first Mishnah. Because tomorrow's DAF and Eruvin is quite short. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah. Bozkin melach al gabe kevesh bishvil shelo yachaliku. You're allowed to spread salt on a ramp, and as we'll see, it's referring not to any ramp, it's referring to the ramp in the Beis HaMikdash, which the Kohanim would walk on barefoot. Let's say it's wet outside one day. Let's say it's a cold, and there's maybe even ice, which is unlikely, in Yerushalayim, but it could happen. And you put down salt. They didn't get this just in Canada. They had this is going back thousands of years, that they would put down salt to give traction to a person's feet, especially on a ramp, so that a person doesn't slip. Umemala in mibor hagula, or hagola, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, umibor hagadol, you're allowed to draw water from these large wells that are contained in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, bigalgal, using some kind of wheel system. It sounds like it's a pulley system with a wheel, and you're allowed to do that on Shabbos. Now, you can only do this in the Beis HaMikdash because apparently there's something problematic about it rabbinically to do it outside the Beis HaMikdash, which the Gemara will try to identify. And umibe'er hakar b'yom tov, and you're allowed to draw water from something called the be'er hakar, which is outside the Beis HaMikdash. You're allowed to draw water from it on Yom Tov. Good morning, Papa.
Good morning.
Welcome. So let's take a look at the Gemara. And let's take a look and see. We have to really define a lot of these things. We don't know what this Be'er Hakar is either, and why Dafka on Yantif and not on Shabbos. So let's take a look at the Gemara. Rami le Rav Ika mi Pashrunya le Rava. This particular rabbi from a city called Pashrunya asked Rava the following question. Tanan Bozkin Melech al Gabe Hakevesh. Notice that his gears of the Mishnah is you're allowed to scatter salt on top of the ramp, which is therefore very clearly defining that it's the ramp of the Beis HaMikdash. Bishvil shelo yachliku, so that they don't slip. So Bamikdash in Bamedina lo. So you see very clearly that the Mishnah is only permitting you to spread salt on the ground inside the Beis HaMikdash, where we suspend shavus, where we suspend rabbinic prohibition. Now, uraminhi, so let's raise now a contradiction. Chatzar sheniskalkala b'meimei gisham imei teven umar deba. There's a courtyard that becomes muddy through the rain, and you want to be able to walk in the courtyard without getting your feet or your shoes dirty. You're allowed to bring straw and spread it out over the mud. So it sounds like you're allowed to do this even outside the Beis HaMikdash. So l'chora, why does the Mishnah only permit you to spread salt inside the temple but not outside the temple? Or when it comes to spreading straw, you can spread it even outside the Beis HaMikdash. That's the question. Shiny tevin de lo mevatele answers the Gemara that straw is fundamentally different from salt. Salt, because it dissolves and because it becomes yucky, so then a person, when he spreads it on the ground, he's going to nullify it. He's going to sort of make it null and void. And as such, he is, in a sense, adding it to the structure of whatever the floor is. And this is the problem. We now discover what the problem is. It's almost just like you're not allowed to be mash vegumos on Shabbos. You're not allowed to smooth out holes in a dirt floor on Shabbos because you're doing an act of boneh. Similarly, spreading out salt for whatever reason on the ground to make it part of the ground is like adding to the ground or to the floor, and it's therefore a tolda, or it's actually a rabbinic problem of boneh. So in the Beis HaMikdash we permit it. Outside the Beis HaMikdash we don't permit it. However, straw, you're not planning to just leave it there permanently. It's only there temporarily. You're going to gather it up and use it for some other purpose later in the future. And therefore, you're not really adding to the floor. You're just putting down a cover to the floor temporarily, since you're not being mevatelit. And therefore, it's not as similar to boneh as spreading down salt. So, Amalei Rav Acha Berei de Rav Rav Ashi, Hai Melech Echidami. So he asks Rava the following question. When we talk about spreading salt, what are we talking about? If you're nullifying it, you're saying, I'm just adding this to the floor, and it's now going to remain there for, permanently. So then the problem is you're adding to the structure of the Beis HaMikdash. And this is not only a problem of Bona and Shabbos, explains Rashi, but it's also a problem of adding to the structure of the temple. You're not allowed to add on to the specifications of the temple by adding your additional flooring to the temple. And v'idlo kamavat kahavya chatzitza. And if you don't mean to be mavatal the salt, if you mean to gather the salt up later on, and Rashi says you could use it, let's say, for tanning, for salting the hides of the animals, that's in theory what you could use it for, then you have another problem. The Kohanim are not stepping on the floor, they're stepping on the salt, and that's a chatzitza. You're not allowed to have any separation between the Kohanim's feet and the floor of the temple, including the ramp. So the Gemara answers, Baholachas evorim lekevesh lavavodahi. Answers the Gemara that in reality, you're not mevatel the salt completely, and the reason why it's not a chatzitza, this is different from what we had seen before, that sometimes people will be mevatel the salt. Here the Gemara is concluding that you're not mevatel the salt. The only problem is a chatzitza. The only time a chatzitza is a problem is when what? Is when you're doing the avoda. Here, they're just carrying the body parts up the ramp, and that part of the service is not a formal part of the avoda, so it's okay if there is a chatzitza. So the Gemara then says, so below, you mean to tell me that carrying the body parts of the animal up the ramp is not avoda? The Torah says that the Kohen shall offer everything and burn it on the altar. And we learned that this means the Torah is referring to the part of the avoda where you carry the body parts up the ramp. So you clearly see that it's an avoda for Kohanim to do. How can you tell me that's it's not a part of the avoda? So Ella Ema Baholachas Eitzim Lamaracha Delav Avodahi. So the Gemara says, in reality, you're right. The only time you're allowed to lay down salt is when the Kohanim early in the morning are bringing up the firewood to add to the stack of firewood in the center of the altar. That is not part of the formal avoda, and therefore the Kohanim are allowed to step on the salt instead of stepping on the ground of the ramp. But it sounds like from what the Gemara's conclusion is that the only time you're allowed to lay down salt, I guess you'd have to wash it off afterwards. Take a hose and rinse it down or whatever you have to do. And then when you're ready to do the avoda, there can't be any salt there.
Presumably, if they're putting it when there's ice or water, it's going to dissolve, so it's going to go away by itself anyway.
It doesn't go away by itself.
Well, it takes time. It depends how large the chunks are. Yeah.
It doesn't go off your driveway.
Yeah. Okay. Darash Rava. Next. Chatzar sheniskalkalo b'meimei geshamim. Mevi teven umeradeba. So once Rava was giving a drasha, he was giving a big shir, and he announced that that if a chatzar becomes muddy, you're allowed to lay down straw and protect people from the mud. So Amalei Rav Papa Rava vehatanya kishuhu merada eino merada lo besalva lo bekupa ela b'shulei kupa. But there's a brisa Rava that says that even when you're laying down straw, even though it's permitted, you have to do it with a shinoi. You can't do it directly because it looks a little bit too much either like an uvda dechol or it looks like you're doing a little bit like bona. So therefore, when you do it, you have to do it with a shinoi. You can't use a regular box or basket, but instead you have to take a broken box, like a box that doesn't have sides to it anymore, and just use it as with some kind of shinoi. So Rava, you were too liberal. So therefore, Hadar Okim Rava Amora Alei V'Darash. So Rava therefore got a guy called an Amora, a fellow with a very loud voice, who would be able to announce the teachings of the shir to the crowd. And he said, Dvarim shamarti lifnechem to sein biyadi baram kacham Mishum Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Elazar uchashum meradeh eno merada lo besalva lo bekupa elo b'shulei kupa. And he basically corrected himself, and he said, what I told you before was not accurate. And in reality, when you place down straw, you have to use a shinoi by using a broken kind of kli in order to lay down the straw. Okay, let's go weiter. Mimala in mibor hagola. You're allowed to draw water from this thing called the bor hagola, and also from this other thing that we called in the Mishnah the Bor Hagadol. These are two wells that are in the Beis HaMikdash, and Ula Ikla Lebei Rav Menashe Asahu Gavra Taraf Abava. So the Gemara is now in the course of analyzing what would possibly be the problem of drawing water with a pulley system. The Gemara first has the following discussion. Once Ula came to visit Rav Menashe, and while he was there, a man came and he knocked on the door. So Amar Man Hai Lischel Gufe de Kamachile L'Shabta. So Ula said contemptuously of this man who has profaned Shabbos, his body should be profaned. Which sounds like he's saying let him become a corpse, but it's not clear. But he was basically giving the guy a curse. So Amarle Rabba lo asru ela kol shel shir. And Rabba said to him, why are you cursing the guy? He didn't do anything wrong. Knocking on the door is permitted on Shabbos because Ula's contention was any kind of noise making is problematic on Shabbos. And Rabba said, no, it's only when you're creating a melodious noise that it's prohibited on Shabbos. But if you're just banging ba'alma is not a problem. So Eisve Abaye, so Abaye challenges that. He says, Malin b'diyufe u'meitifin miyark l'chola b'Shabbos. So there are two things that you're allowed to do for a chola, for a sick person on Shabbos. One is Malin midiyufe, that you're allowed to do a siphon system. Now, you know how to siphon. Someone told me that you can do this to siphon steal gas from a guy's car. And I said to him, how do you know about such things? I don't ask questions. But a siphon, basically, you take a hose and you put it in one container with water, you suck, and then you put the other end of the hose into another empty container, and it siphons fluid from one side to the other. That's right. Right. It works through physics.
It has to be lower, right?
Right.
The receiving vessel has to be lower.
The receiving vessel, I believe, has to be lower. Right. Yes. It uses gravity, uses physics, whatever the process it uses. Fine.
I saw it plenty.
Yeah. Okay.
In Russia.
Okay. So in any event, you're allowed to do that for a chola, even though it's some kind of uvda dechol. And the other thing that you're allowed to do for a chola is you're allowed to use a yark. Now, what is a yark? A yark or a york is Rashi explains, there's again, using physics. Just imagine when you play with your drink when you're a kid, you have to take the straw and you put your thumb over the top, and then the water stays inside. So they had a special utensil that was used for creating dripping water into a lower vessel. And what they would have is it would be a metal container, and on the bottom of the container there were small little holes. And on the top there was a larger hole that you could put your finger over. So you'd fill it up with water, put your finger over, then you bring it over to the metal saucer that it would be suspended over, and then you take your finger off and it would go drip, 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 drip. That's the way. Now, what was the purpose of this? So it seems like from Rashi, that the purpose of it was to create a very calming kind of sound on Shabbos. And not on Shabbos, which is create a very calming sound, almost like like they have today these recordings of soothing sounds of waterfalls, right, water flowing, the ocean, waves, things like that. So you're allowed to do this for a chola on Shabbos. So the Gemara says lechola in labari lo. You're only allowed to do this for a chola, but not for a healthy person. So hechidami lav denayim v'kaboy delitar shmamino olude kala asir. So you see, even when you just want to wake up a chayla because he's sleeping, but you don't want to wake him up abruptly because of his medical condition, so you just want to make a sound that is going to be a little bit less violent. So you create this sound for the chayla to wake him up, like a very soothing alarm clock. And you see that even noise making that's not melodious is problematic on Shabbos because we only permit it for a chayla, but we don't permit it for a regular person. So the Gemara says, "Lo detir v'kaboy deleinim demishtama kikala dim zimzume." So the Gemara says, no. In reality, we're talking about a chayla who's awake, and we want to get him to sleep, and we use this water because it sounds like little tinkling bells to calm him. So therefore, because we want him to sleep, we want to put him to sleep, and that's why this is problematic. Because if you're not a chayla, it's almost like a melodious sound. That's why it's problematic. But stam, just to make a noise like this, to make stam a noise so that you should get person's attention, the Gemara is maintaining that that's okay. So Eisve, let's now bring another challenge. Hamashamer peirosav mipnei ha'ofos uv'lo mipnei ha'chaya mishamer kedarko b'Shabbos u'v'lvad shelo yisapek v'lo yitafeach v'lo yiraked kederech shehin osin b'chol. That if you're watching over your field on Shabbos and you want to make sure that the crows don't eat your produce, and they don't bother, or you want to protect your melons or your pumpkins from getting eaten by critters, by animals, so you're allowed to stay there in the field, and you can just shoo the animals away, provided that that you can't make noise, you can't clap, you can't bang on your thigh, you can't stomp with your feet in the way that you do it during the week. So you see, my time molid kala v'chalaludi kala asir. So you see, it must be because of noise making, and any noise making is problematic, even if it's not for melodious purposes. So the Gemara says no. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov gezer Shem yitol tzror. The answer is that no, it's that the reason why that's prohibited over there is not because of noise making. That's not the reason why you're not allowed to clap. The reason why is because we're worried that if we allow you to make noises the way you normally do during the week, you're going to come to pick up a pebble and throw it at the animal as well, which is also what you do during the week, and you're going to be over on the malacha of hotza'ah on Shabbos, of carrying. So ve'ela hada amar Rav Yehuda Marav Nashim hamasachkos be'egozim aser. There's another statement that Rav made. He said that women who play with marbles, really it's not marbles, it's nuts, but that's how they played marbles back then. So he said that they're not allowed to play with it on Shabbos. So my taima, lav de kamolit kala v'chalalude kala aser. Isn't it because you're clanking the marbles, the nuts together, and you're doing noise making, and that's why it's prohibited? Once again, you see that noise making, even if it's not for melody, is prohibited. Lo dilma asi la ashvuye gumos. He says no. The reason is not because of noise making. The reason is because when you play marbles, as every child from Brooklyn knows, you got to go over to a place where you smooth down the ground, and we're worried that you're going to fill in holes on Shabbos. That's the reason why you can't play marbles on Shabbos. The ilo tema hachi hada amar Rav Yehuda nashim mesachkos betapuchim aser hasamaylude kalaika eladilma asi la shvuye gumos. So he says, because I'll prove it to you, because another halacha that was also stated is that women who play with apples are not allowed to do that on Shabbos. I guess they would roll apples and bang them, use maybe like a carom or billiard kind of game with apples. They're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. So why not? There's no noise making when you clank an apple against another apple. It doesn't make a noise. So you have to conclude that it's got nothing to do with noise making. It's got to do with being mash v'gumos, with smoothing down the floor.
Isn't ein mechavim?
Atavar sheino miskavim.
In this
no, so Chazal was sometimes prohibited if your whole intention, but here you are mechavim. Your kavana is you want a flat floor. You want a flat floor, so that is it's a davar hamiskavim. Your intention is to fill in the holes. The concern is that if we let you play with it, you will come to flatten the ground. That's why it's problematic. Tanan. So Mishnah now says, "Mimalin mibor hagolo mibor hagadol begalgal b'Shabbos b'mikdashin b'Medina lo." So once again, let's go back now to our Mishnah. You're allowed to fill using this pulley wheel system. You're allowed to draw water from these wells that are in the Beis Hamikdash, but only in the Beis Hamikdash, not outside. So now we see the connection. My time alav mishum dalude kala va'aser. It must be because this pulley system makes a lot of noise. Clang, 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 clang. As you're drawing the water, as you're lowering the bucket into the water and pulling the bucket out of the water, it makes a lot of noise. So our thinking is that's the reason why it's asur. Once again, a proof that noise making is asur on Shabbos. The Gemara says low. The answer is not because of noise making that it's asur outside the temple, but rather because since you're drawing such a large amount of water and it's done in such a conventional industrial fashion, we're worried that you'll be tempted to take some of the water and irrigate your lawn or irrigate your garden. So that's the whole reason why it's us, and we only permit it in the Beis Hamikdash. So a meimer shar lemimla begilgala b'machuza, and based on that, a meimer permitted the people of Machuza, which was the city, he permitted people to draw water with a galgal, with this wheel system on Shabbos. And why? Because Omer my time agozer rabbanan shema yamalu leginasu lechurvaso hacha logina ika v'lo churva ika. So he said the whole reason why the rabbis forbade it outside the temple to begin with is because you may come to water your lawn or your garden. He said in this situation, people in the big city don't have gardens, they don't have lawns, and therefore there's no concern. So the Gemara says, but no, kevin de kachaza de ka taru bakisna asalu. But once he saw that even people in the city were drawing large amounts of water using the wheel system, and then they would take the leftover water and they would soak their flax in it. And that, of course, is also problematic on Shabbos. And therefore he said, He said, now that I see that people use this water for improper purposes, even in the city, he prohibited even in the city. Be'er hakar, and you're also allowed to draw water from this thing called the Be'er hakar, the kar well, but only on Yantif and not on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, what is Be'er hakar? Amar Shmuel, bor shehikru aleha dvarim v'hitiruha. The word kar, explains Rashi, comes from the word kara or mikra, from a text, and it basically is a well that the rabbis deliberated over ancient texts and were able to find a heter to allow us to draw water from it. And that's why it's called Be'er Hakar, from the lashon of kriya. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, lo kol haboros hakaros hitiru elazu bilvad, v'i amart shehikru devarim aleha maizu bilvad. So the Brisa says that they did not permit all boros hakaros. And if you're going to tell me, but they only permitted one bor hakar. So the Gemara's question is, if you're going to tell me that the word kar is from the word mikra, and it means that the rabbis used texts to prove that the bor was permitted, then how can you tell me that it only applies to one bor? If the word kar means a textual proof that you can use it, then any bor that is called by that name should have textual proofs to permit it. So Ella Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Be'er Mayim Chaim. But rather Rav Nachman says the word Be'er Hakar, the word kar comes from the word makor, which means it's a wellspring. It's a wellspring that replenishes itself subterraneously. That's what the rabbis permitted for you to use on Yontif, but not on Shabbos. Shenamar kehikir ber meimeha v'goimer. As it says that, as the pasuk sort of indicates, the word hekir, kehakir, is from the word makor, that just like a well replenishes itself, Kain hakarera asa, right, and so forth and so on, from a pasuk in Yirmiyah. So the
hitter was.
What we don't, first of all, we don't even see what the prohibition should be. We know that we know that we've talked about before, pasei biros. The rabbis permitted travelers to draw from wells that were dug from the times of the second Beis Hamikdash. They permitted people to draw water from it even on Shabbos. So we haven't yet seen what the problem of these well springs are. So it sounds like, if we're going to analyze it properly, that we're going back to the issue of the galgal. Right. That it's not just the question of permitting you to draw water, but we permit you to draw water with the galgal, to draw large quantities of water, because we're dealing with a specific well that, even though it's outside the Beis Hamikdash and we wouldn't allow you to use it on Shabbos, but on Yontif we will allow you to use it. Why? Because there's a specific kind of well that is identified as something that was well used from ancient times. And this is supported by the following statement. Gufa lo kol haboros hakaros itiru elazu bilvad. They didn't permit you to use the galgal system, the wheel system, to draw from any old wellspring. They only permitted this wellspring. That when the Jews came to build the second Beis Hamikdash, and they came from the Golah, they came from the diaspora, they encamped there, and the Nevi'im that came with them to build the second temple, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they permitted it. And not only did these Nevi'im permit it, but they hearkened back to an even earlier time when it was permitted by their ancestors. So apparently, and we really don't have the full story from the Gemara. The Gemara does not provide us with the history here. But apparently there was a time even before the building of the second temple that, for whatever reason, since this was a major intersection where water was a really important commodity, the rabbis permitted to draw even large quantities of water, but only on Yontif and not on Shabbos. Let us go weiter. The Mishnah now says, Sheretz shenimtza b'mikdash kohen motziho behemyano shelo lishos es hatuma divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. We're talking about a case where a dead sheretz, which is a source of tumah, is found inside somewhere in the Beis Hamikdash. So comes along Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, and he says, the Kohen who finds it should dispose of it as quickly as possible, but he should not pick it up with his hand, because then he's going to become tamei, because it's a sheretz. But what should he do? He should take off his sash and pick it up with his sash. And since he's not handling it directly, he will not become tamei, because there's no tumas masa by a sheretz. You don't become tamei by just having the weight of the sheretz bear down on you, as long as you're not touching it. The only thing that is going to happen is that your sash will become tamei, but you'll deal with that. You'll have to be matahir it afterwards. You'll take it to a mikveh. Rabbi Yehuda Omer B'tzeves Shel Eitz Shelo Laharbos Esatuma. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says you should use wooden tongs. Now, wooden tongs are what are called pshute kli eitz. They are non-concave wooden utensils, and they also do not contract tumah. But basically what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that you should not use the sash, even though the sash is the quickest method of removal of the sheretz from the Beis HaMikdash. Better that you should wait an extra few minutes to go to the storage shed where you can find a pair of tongs and then come back and remove it, even though you're going to allow a certain amount of time to elapse. It's better to do it this way, because this way you won't end up being metame the sash. So me'echen motzian oso min ha'echel min ha'ulam min bein ha'ulam v'la mizbech div Reb Shimon ben Nanas. Now Reb Shimon ben Nanas says that the only time you have a right on Shabbos to remove the sheretz is if the sheretz's position in the temple is in the holiest of places. It has to be found in the heichal or the ulam, which is the covered parts of the Beis HaMikdash, or if you find it in the area from the entrance of the ulam to the mizbeach. Those are the holiest parts of the Beis HaMikdash, and only then can you remove it. But otherwise, you have to sort of just cover it over and wait until Shabbos is over. But Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kol makom shechayavin al zdono kares vel shegagaso chatos misham motzion oso. That Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says, no, the entire Beis HaMikdash is fair game for this halacha. Any place where, if you were to bring a sheretz into the temple, you would get kares for it, that's also where, if you find the sheretz there, you have to remove it on Shabbos. So therefore, the entire court, all of the courtyards of the temple are included. You're not just limited to finding the sheretz in the heichal or and so forth in order to have a mandate to remove it. Ushar kol hamekomos kofen alav psach tar. Now, both according to Reb Shimon ben Nanas and according to Rabbi Akiva, in their respective places where they say you remove the sheretz, if you find it outside of those places and it's still in the temple, so for Reb Shimon ben Nanas, if you find it somewhere in the courtyard, or according to Rabbi Akiva, if you find it somewhere in the lishkos, in the chambers that are off of the courtyards, in which case you don't have a heter to remove it on Shabbos, then you take a bowl, you invert it over the sheretz to sort of protect people from coming in contact with it, and you wait until after Shabbos to remove it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Makom shehitiru lecha chachamim mishalcha nastin lecha, shelo hitiru lecha ela mishum shavus. Rabbi Shimon makes a very generic statement, and we're not really sure what he is referring to. He basically is saying as follows. He's saying that any time that the chachamim alleviated a prohibition, they're alleviating something that is already permitted to you, because there is no biblical prohibition that the Chachamim can come to alleviate. They can only alleviate something that's only rabbinically prohibited. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon wants to make sure that you understand that Chazal are never vested with the power to suspend the Nisr D'Oraisa. When they're giving you a heter, they're giving you a heter for something that already from the Torah is permitted anyway.
Is the sheretz dead or alive?
The only time a sheretz transmits tum is when it's dead. A living sheretz does not transmit tumah. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Amar Rav Tavi bar Kisna, Amar Shmuel, Hamachnis Tamei sheretz lemikdash chayev, but sheretz atzmo pater. So Rav Tavi says something very interesting. He says that if I bring a kli, or a human being that became tamei from a sheretz, into the temple, that's where I get kares if I do it b'mezid, and I have to bring a korban chatas if I do it b'shogeg. But if I bring a dead sheretz itself into the Beis HaMikdash, I don't get punished by the Torah. It's aser, but I don't get punished by the Torah with kares. My taima, what's the reason? Amar kra mizachar biad nekeva tishalechu. Because the Torah says that there is a commandment to remove tumah from male to female has to be removed from the camp, from the place of kedusha. Mi sheyesh lo tahara b'mikvah yatzaseres shein lo tahara. So tahara b'mikvah. That this, therefore, the Torah is only requiring me to remove from the camp an object like a kli that can be purified. But an object that's not subject to purification, like a sheretz itself, is never under the rubric of obligation to remove it from the temple, and therefore there's no isser, there's no punishment of kares by bringing it into the Beis HaMikdash in the first place.
Sheretz into the temple without a utensil.
You pick up a dead sheretz and you bring it inside.
But he's making himself.
Fine, but the question is, am I chayiv, or what? Let's say I pick it up with a piece of paper. Okay, I'm not using a kli, right? Or with wooden tongs.
Okay.
Yeah, I bring it in, I put it down, and I deposit it there. I don't get kares, is what the Gemara is saying. So now the Gemara says, Lema misayeyale, let us say that the following supports that statement of Rav Tavi. Mizachar ad nekeva tishalechu pratli klicheres divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. That a similar brisa that's stated by Rabbi Yossi Haglili is that based on the very same pasuk same pasuk that talks about from male to female you shall send out of the camp is excluding a klicheres that became tamei. If you bring a klicheres that is tamei into the Beis Hamikdash, you don't get kares. So my taima lav mishum delesle tahara b'mikvah. It's probably because the klicheres can never be purified, because once a klicheres becomes tamei, you have to break it. There's no way to remedy the tumah in a klicheres. So you see from here that anything that cannot be purified, there's no prohibition of midiraisa, or certainly no isser kares, of bringing it into the Beis Hamikdash. So that proves the point that we've just been saying about sheretz as well. So the Gemara says, lo. Mi shenasa av hatuma, yatsa klicheres she'eno nasa av hatuma. The Gemara says, no, that's not really what Rabbi Yossi Haglili is getting at. He's not saying that a klicheres is not subject to the isser kares because it can never be purified. He's saying that a klicheres, there's no isser kares when you bring it in because it can never become an av hatuma. Now, what does that mean? It can never become an av hatuma. So Rashi explains there are two ways that a kli can become an av hatuma. Either because weight from a zav is borne down upon a kli, or a corpse touches a kli. In both of those cases, says Rashi, a klicheres cannot become tamei. Why? Because if a zav bears his weight down on a klicheres, it's usually going to break. That's the presumption, right, that we're making. And for a corpse to touch a klicheres is not subject to becoming, well, I guess to a certain degree, is not subject to becoming tamei. It won't become an av hatuma, is really what we mean to say. It'll still become tamei, but it won't become an av hatuma. And Rashi says that we learn this out from a pasuk, that the only time that a kli can become an av hatuma is if it can become purified afterwards. But because a klicheres can never be purified, it can never become an av hatuma from a mace. And that's what Rabbi Yossi Haglili is driving at. He's basically saying that since this is something that can never become an av hatuma, it is not subject to the halacha of mizachar bi'ad nekeva tishalechu, and therefore you don't get kares if you bring it in. We're not advocating that it's mutter, we're just saying that there's no isser kares, but it's talking about a totally different halacha, and you cannot line up Rabbi Yossi Haglili's shita with the shita that says that you're allowed to bring a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash. So leima kitanai, but let us say that this issue of whether you can bring a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash midioraisa is a machlokus of our Mishnah, because it says in our Mishnah, sheretz shenimsa b'mikdash koin motziu behem yano shalol l'shahos esatuma divrei Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'tzeva shaletz motziu shalol l'rabos esatuma. Our machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehuda was: is it better to take it out quickly with the sash, or is it better to wait a moment and to avoid making the sash tamei and bringing it out with wooden tongs? So my lav b'hakamifli. Let us suggest that the machlokas is as follows: the manda amar shalol l'shahos kisaver hamachna sheretz l'mikdash chayev. That if you hold that it's better not to delay and to pick it up with your sash, is because he holds that by bringing a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash, you get an isser kares. So therefore, every moment that you allow the sheretz to linger, you're indulging in isser kares, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says you got to use your sash and pick it up as soon as possible. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says no, better to wait a moment to get the wooden tongs, he's of the opinion that there's no problem of bringing a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash. So it's not a big deal if you let it remain there for a few more seconds. You're not doing anything wrong. So the Gemara says, lo. No, that's not the correct interpretation of the machlokas, because I could tell you, the kulei al machayev, that both Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka and Rabbi Yehuda both hold that there is an isser kares of bringing a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash. But the machlokas is as follows: Mar savar shuhu ye tuma adif, that one opinion says that it's the lesser of two evils. In other words, if you have a choice of delaying the sheretz's removal or making the sash tamei, he says it's better to delay the tumah. That's the lesser of two evils than making the sash tamei. Umar savar afushe tuma adif, and the other opinion is no, it's better to make the sash tamei to hasten the removal of the sheretz. It's just really a question of which is the lesser of two evils. They're both aser. You're not allowed to keep a sheretz in the Beis Hamikdash any longer than necessary, and you're also not allowed to make the big day kahuna tamei. The question is which is the lesser of two evils, and this is the machlokas. Ella kahani tanoi. But rather, if you want to suggest whether that there's a machlokas tanoim as to whether you can bring a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash, or whether it's a kares, I should say, the machlokas would be as for the second issue that is discussed in our Mishnah, which is it's not mehechan motzian oso. From where do you remove the sheretz? In other words, at what place does the sheretz have to be in the Beis Hamikdash to allow you to remove it on Shabbos? And so there we have this machlokas between Reb Shimon ben Nanas and Rabbi Akiva. Reb Shimon ben Nanas says you can only remove it on Shabbos if you find it in the holiest of the places, but if you find it in the courtyard, you just have to leave it. And Rabbi Akiva says no, anywhere you find it inside the Beis Hamikdash, you have to remove it. So my laf b'haka miflagi. So therefore, it seems that this is the machlokas. Demando omer me azara lo kesavar hamachna sheretz Demando omer me azara lo. According to Shimon ben Nanas, who says that you cannot remove the sheretz on Shabbos if you only find it in the courtyard, is kesavar machna sheretz l'mikdash patri. He holds that there is no iser kares of bringing a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash, and that's why he only says that there's a heter when it's in the holiest of places. But if it's tam in the azara in the courtyard, there Shimon ben Nanas says, look, since there's no iser kares to begin with, we don't give you a heter to remove it. But Rabbi Akiva says no. Any place where you find it in the azara, you have to remove it. It holds because there's an iser kares anytime you bring a sheretz into the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore even in the azara you have to get rid of it as quickly as possible to alleviate the iser kares. And that's what the Gemara is going to stick with for now, and that's where we'll hold it for today.